Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to be here to share with you new research on HR trends and Paychex's 2022 Pulse of HR survey. So this survey was conducted and started in April 2022, and Paychex surveyed over 1,000 companies of all different sizes and all different industries to really get after what challenges companies are facing today. And what they discovered was that recruiting, engaging, and retaining talent has never been more challenging. And what we're going to talk about today is how HR has transformed and continues to transform. Companies are rethinking their strategies, they're rethinking their technology options that they have available, and we're seeing all sorts of change in the market, everything from the Great Resignation to the labor shortage to quiet quitting, all of these trends that we've all been talking about for the past year. We're going to really uncover what changes we're seeing within HR. We're going to talk about the challenges, we're going to talk about the strategies, and we're going to finally talk about the technology enablers. So we will get started now. So what are we going to exactly cover today? Well, we're going to talk about the survey, and I'll share with you a little bit about the methodology and how Paychex went about creating the survey study. And then we're going to talk about some key findings from that report, everything from recruiting to employee burnout, to performance, to hybrid and remote work. We're going to talk about technology and that path to digital transformation. And we're going to finally wrap it up with some Q&A and ask if any of you have any questions. So just a little bit about the survey and the methodology to conduct this research. So Paychex conducted this research, as I mentioned earlier, in April 2022. They closed the survey out in May of this year as well. And they surveyed over 1,000 HR decision makers, again, at all different companies and company sizes around the United States. And this survey is an annual survey that Paychex has been doing for 6 years. So you're going to see some year-over-year trends throughout this presentation. So key learnings. So we're going to start with some of the findings. These are really interesting to me, especially when we get into some of the hybrid remote work discussions that we're going to have. But before we even get into the trends, I just want to take a minute and say what an amazing industry I believe this is, an amazing profession that HR is. I try to do this in all the presentations I give, is just take a minute to say that the work you do is so important. It's important to your organization. You're impacting the lives of your employees. And it's really meaningful work. And we're seeing more and more individuals, even starting at the college level, starting to really recognize what an amazing profession this is. And I know the work that you're doing has probably doubled over the past few years with the pandemic and with supporting your employees. But I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. So with that, we are going to actually start with a poll. We have 2 polls for this presentation, and we're going to start with the first one here today. And I'm going to ask, what is the most time-consuming HR task for you personally in your day-to-day jobs? Is it developing and implementing return to office policies? Is it chasing down employee for time and work hours that they've accumulated? Is it devising workplace health and safety guides? Researching, trying to keep up with federal, state, and local regulations? Or is it merging data from different systems to make informed decisions? So we're going to launch this poll now, and we'll take a few minutes before we dive into what we found in the research study. So I have my guesses here from what we'll see, and I was definitely surprised when I saw the results from this study. Okay, we'll just take another few seconds here, and I think we are ready to share the results. Great, thank you all so much for participating. So it looks like for most of you, the #1 challenge and most time-consuming task for you personally is merging data from different systems to make informed decisions. And this does not surprise me at all. There's so many interviews that I do at the company I work for, Aptitude, where we find this data management challenge takes up so much time. And often you think that you're investing in innovative solutions, and it's super difficult to get them implemented and to actually see some adoption when data management's not in place. And then the second finding here from this poll is researching and trying to keep up with federal, state, and local regulations. And that seems to change every single week and every single month. So we definitely saw even a few announcements this year that definitely would impact, companies having to keep up with those regulations. So that it's definitely time consuming. So thank you all for that. I'm going to share with you what we actually found, which was surprising to me. You can see here the number one task that we found for this year was chasing down employees' time and work and their hours. And the number two task was what all of you said is your number two task, researching and trying to keep up with those regulations. It's interesting because tracking staffing hours, it's the most time-consuming task here. But what we found in years past, and you can see this, is data management and even compliance were priority over tracking down those hours. So we're seeing quite a shift in, this time-consuming work of tracking down hours, even over compliance. And I think a lot of that relates to remote work and hybrid work. Companies really have to think about what the new arrangements of work are, what the expectations are from their employees. And a lot of companies are still trying to figure that out. I think there's this idea that we may have moved past the remote hybrid discussion, and we definitely have not. A lot of companies are still trying to figure out what the return to work policies will be. And there's new tasks that go into that. There's new tasks around safety and health guidelines. So, interesting to see that as the number one task for HR today. So with that, we're going to dive into some of the trends. And the first trend is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's on recruitment, finding, onboarding, and retaining talent. And what this study found is that half of respondents identified these HR activities as they were least effective, which is very interesting because we know how important recruitment is. We know how important talent acquisition and onboarding and retention is. It's all over the news. It's definitely not just an HR story. It's a story that's impacting every business today. And yet for most companies, half of companies, they're not satisfied or they don't view their policies and their strategies as effective. So it's interesting, and I think there's a few factors that play into this. One is the recruiter experience and the HR experience. This got a lot of attention over the past year as we saw HR professionals and talent acquisition professionals leaving their jobs and looking for other work, feeling burnt out. We found in our research at Aptitude that 1 in 3 recruiters are looking for new job opportunities, and 30% of companies said that their recruiters are more burnt out this year than last. So this idea of recruiter experience and HR experience is definitely a very relevant topic, and I think impacts the satisfaction and the effectiveness of a lot of these activities. If companies don't have the support they need, if they're not giving their HR teams or their talent acquisition teams the tools that they need to be successful, they're not going to be satisfied with how they're approaching this. It's interesting because when the study asked respondents what was working well in these areas, employee referrals, hiring remotely, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were the top responses. So companies felt that those were more effective than some of their other areas. Those were the top tactics and third-party job sites. The other interesting piece is when the study asked what would encourage candidates to actually accept an offer, higher pay, providing more remote opportunities and more remote work options, and improving the company culture all came up as the top reasons for candidates actually accepting an offer. And there's been so much in the news about candidates ghosting and actually not even showing up for an interview or day one. So those are really the factors that came into play about why a candidate would actually accept a job offer. The number one impact on the effectiveness of retention was flexibility again, remote work, increasing compensation, which makes a lot of sense, and improving employee engagement and committing to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all reasons to impact retention. It's interesting because this study also found that 27% of companies said that pay transparency would boost retention. And there's been a lot of discussion around pay transparency and how companies can really use that as not only a retention tool, but also as a recruitment tool as well. So these are a few case studies that Paychex did, and you can see here for companies what's been working in these areas. Offering a flexible schedule is essential for us to help attract people We've also implemented a sign-on bonus program to encourage candidates to choose us. Sign-on bonuses became really big in 2020 and continue to be a huge part of the talent acquisition process for a lot of companies today. And it even extends outside of industries that you would typically expect to see sign-on bonuses, like financial services or technology. We're seeing this really across many different industries and many different job levels. So the sign-on bonuses has been definitely a big part of that talent acquisition strategy. And another one has been employee referrals. So you can see here this quote, our company uses job referral boards to find job candidates and hybrid work options and flexible schedules to attract them. We need this tool more than ever to support our business plans. We did research at Aptitude this year looking at employee referrals, and what we found is that 84% of companies believe that employee referrals are the most effective source of hire. And I think that makes sense. That's been typically the holy grail of sourcing is we use our employee referral programs. We also found that companies that were using employee referral programs effectively were 2 times more likely to improve quality of hire, 2 times more likely to improve first-year retention, and 24% of those companies were able to actually improve the candidate experience. So different strategies and different ways that companies are really looking at having more effective recruitment, onboarding, and retention strategies. That's our first trend. And our second trend is a big one. And some of these findings were really interesting and surprising to me, is around hybrid and remote work. So this study found that only 15% of companies have staff working entirely on site. So again, I think there's this idea or mentality out there that we've moved past this discussion around hybrid work and companies have all figured it out, or it's not really the most important thing anymore. And it's actually still as relevant as it was even a few years ago. Companies are trying to put their policies in place. They're trying to figure out what employees want from a work environment and what would make them most effective, and also what the future looks like. And still, with the pandemic still here, and employees really thinking about their own personal safety, both physical and psychological safety, we're not really at a place where we know exactly what work is going to look like in the future. A lot of companies are still figuring out, are we going to stay remote? Are we going to implement a hybrid policy? Some strategies that companies have identified to support remote or hybrid employees are scheduling one-on-one meetings to ensure consistency, making sure employees feel connected and they feel engaged within their workforce. The next one is using technology to optimize remote employee productivity. This, to me, is, the biggest takeaway from the past 2 years is how important technology is. We found in our research at Aptitude that companies are increasing their spend on HR technology. That goes across HR, employee experience, all things technology. And even if we hit a recession or even if we hit an economic downturn, that focus on technology and the investment in technology remains the same. We need technology regardless of what we're going through, because we have a workforce that is hybrid or is remote and relies on connection and the use of improved experiences. So this idea that technology has really changed our workforce is absolutely true and will continue to be true. And then the final piece is providing a secure method for employees to get confidential answers to HR questions. And this is a really big deal for employees working remotely. If you have questions and you want to, again, feel safe and protected within your workforce, you want to be able to have a platform and a way to be able to ask those questions and feel like you're getting a response in a timely way that feels secure and feels confidential. And that, and for a lot of companies that have done employee engagement surveys over the past year, that really resonates. That's really where they're seeing employees, really feel like they're getting the support that they need. This is interesting too. So really looking at this idea of remote and flexible work, and as HR plans for what this future might look like and what policies should look like and how they should shape up, you can see there's really a mix of many different policies in place for organizations. 21% of respondents said each department, location, or business unit sets or will set its own remote work policies. 21% said remote work is or will be an option for people whose job allows it for them to have that. 13% of remote work is or will be an ongoing option. 13% say it will be an ongoing option on days of an employee's choosing. 13% say that the staff at certain levels in the organization are or will be allowed to have remote work. 13% say that remote work is or will be an option for people who can demonstrate a need. And this was interesting to me. Only 4% said the entire team works or will work permanently from home. So we are going to see this hybrid, flexible work model for many organizations. And it's really, again, not a one size fits all. We're going to see many different varieties of how this is being done. And for a lot of companies, this will change throughout the year. We've already seen that companies might kind of continue to change these policies. So from this survey and from the research that Paychex conducted, what are some strategies to help companies as they navigate this uncertainty of the future, but also this remote and hybrid work model? And you can see here just a few strategies and a few examples. Number one, survey employees to understand how they feel about returning to work. This is such a big deal, and I think it's such a miss for a lot of organizations. For many of you, you're doing employee engagement surveys. You might be doing those once a year. You might be doing pulse surveys multiple times throughout the year. But you want to make sure you ask employees what they want. What do they feel comfortable with? What would they like for the future? What would make them want to return to work if that's a priority for your company? But start to ask and collect that feedback. So often these policies are made in a bubble without really going out to employees and ask what that sentiment is for them as well. So if you have surveys already in place, definitely leverage those. There's, probably other providers that you're using that can help support those efforts too, but that's definitely a great place to start. The next piece is around communication. Talk about the why behind hybrid work. I think this idea of work and the future really is a communication issue for a lot of organizations. We have to be able to communicate what those policies are. And that's not just for your employees, that's for candidates too. A lot of candidates are going to have questions in interviews. They're going to want to understand what's expected and what's going to change over the next few years. Being able to communicate what those policies are, even if they're going to change, is so important. It builds that trust. It builds a stronger relationship between employees. The next strategy is giving employees notice to be able to make necessary changes in their lives. And I think that's important too. If you're going to change the policy, and if we go back to the slide that we were just on with all the different varieties of how companies are approaching flexibility, we have to be able to give notice. We can't just change the policy and say, tomorrow we'd like to see half of you in the office. We have to be able to think about, what this looks like. The next strategy, and a lot of companies are doing this, is adopting a split week hybrid model. So can we have some employees come in Monday through Wednesday and others come in Thursday and Friday? Can we think about how do we get people in, but making sure that they feel safe and making sure that we're not asking for 100% of in-person, in-office experiences? Can we split that week up, and can we see some changes in our productivity if we do that? And companies are experimenting with that. There's even solutions out there that are thinking about how do we share roles? Can we have a role that maybe two people are doing, give some people that might feel a little bit burnt out a break, but still get the same amount of work done? So there's a lot of experimenting going on with split week or role share, whatever you want to describe it as, but figuring out what works for your company, and then also being able to change it if it's not working. And then the final piece here and the strategy here that came through the research is communicating safety procedures around COVID and promoting open door conversations. Employees have to feel safe, not only physically to come back and be in your office, but they have to feel safe to be able to talk about what matters to them. And that extends beyond the COVID conversations. That extends into what makes an employee feel safe and psychologically safe in your work environment. We have to have those open door policies to make sure that employees can share what their experiences are. So the next trends, we just talked about remote work, and we've talked about recruiting and retaining talent. The next trend and key learning that we're going to discuss is redefining employee performance. I love this one because employee performance for a lot of companies has been broken for years and years, and it still remains this topic. And for a lot of companies, we still do performance reviews and performance evaluations in the same way. we do them once a year, or we, wait and kind of do this in a way that feels intimidating to employees, feels overwhelming to managers, feels like it's a waste of time for everyone. And yet there are better options. So what came through in the research is for some organizations thinking about performance reviews that will ignore employee location. So not, making this a performance review based on who comes into the office and who's working from home. How can we give everyone a fair and equitable review process? The next one is ability to learn new skills will be increasingly important. This whole conversation around skills has been so important this year. Skills is definitely the future of our workforce, and we have to think about upskilling and reskilling our workforce. And when we think about the performance review process and the performance evaluation process, it's not just a one check the box activity that we share performance feedback and then the employees on their own to figure it out. How do we give employees the tools they need to learn, to develop new skills, to make connections in a new way, to build out career paths that might be more meaningful for their own personal lives and for the company as well? So this idea of skills and how important it is for organization definitely needs to be part of this conversation around performance. The next strategy here is providing more emphasis on an employee's ability to communicate effectively online. And this is important for, again, back to this remote, hybrid, flexible work model. We have to think about how employees communicate and what's been effective. For a lot of companies, the number one form of communication is email, and that's the go-to. And yet what we found in our research at Aptitude is that 47% of employees, they don't even open an email from HR. So how do we think about providing communication and changing this conversation around communication, not just in the tone of our communication, but in the vehicle that we use as well? Can we make communication more personal, more relevant, more meaningful? Can we use communication tools that actually reach employees where they live? For a lot of hourly workers and for high volume companies, communication isn't going to come through an email. It needs to come through text. It needs to come through maybe messaging. A lot of companies are looking at conversational AI as a more effective communication tool. But we really have to think about how employees will be most effective working remotely and what communication channels will enable that. And again, that's not a one size fits all. And it's not a check the box. We really have to think about what this omni-channel approach will look like. The next strategy and key learning from the research is more opportunities for training and career development. I love this one because for so long, the key trends that we talk about in HR really weren't employee first. They were company first. And we're seeing this whole conversation around career development and internal mobility, changing that conversation and saying, how do we put the employee first? How do we think about what's best and in the best interest of our people, not just for our organization? And career development and internal mobility have been huge areas of opportunity for organizations over the past year. What the study found is a few strategies and tools and opportunities include, first, technology to support communication around goal setting and career advancement and development. How do we think about enabling and empowering employees to be able to really think about setting their own goals and thinking about owning their career journeys? The next key trend here is employee training, skill building. Again, back to skills. The use case for skills is so powerful when you think about career development and internal mobility. How can we empower employees to think about what skills they need to be successful, what opportunities they want for the future? How can they connect with other employees at the organization to help build those skills? How can they think about, having access to different training and learning and development programs to be able to build those skills? And then how can they think about changing and continuing to own that journey for their own future? So this idea of career development, internal mobility, and skills, they're all intertwined. And, if you think about just the internal mobility process for a lot of companies, it's been broken. We create these beautiful internal career sites. We ask internal employees to take it on themselves to be able to find opportunities. Most people don't want to ask their manager. to be able to help find opportunities, but we ask for them to kind of take it on themselves and find these opportunities. They might apply for a job or apply to transition within the organization. And then oftentimes they're just treated like a stranger. They go through the exact same process that external candidates go through to be able to, get a new job and to change within their own organization. And that often creates, resentment with individuals at the organization. So we have to think about personalizing this career development journey and making sure that if we do have a culture for internal mobility, that internal candidates feel that they are recognized as contributors to this workforce. And the final strategy I'll talk about here is training for managers to support employee career advancement and development. This is so important. And I think there is, again, this mentality that managers don't want to help employees get new jobs. So employees don't go to their managers. Companies don't really even broach that conversation. They just let employees find their own career path. But managers actually can be a huge support system for career development and for internal mobility, but oftentimes they just don't have the tools or the training that they need to support employees. So giving managers the tools they need, giving them, access to skills development programs, access to these training programs for employees, opening up these doors of communication can really create a culture of career development, not just one that, requires employees to seek out their own opportunities in a very private way. So a few examples here too, and of making this case for hybrid and remote work. 4 in 10 HR leaders believe that remote and hybrid work improves employee physical, emotional, and financial well-being. It boosts retention, it enhances quality of work, it increases productivity. So I think these are also great reminders too. If we think that the path has to be return to work, really look at your own organization and say, what are our goals? What are our priorities? And what will make us successful? A lot of companies have been very successful with this transition to a more flexible work environment. So we're actually going to launch our second and our last poll right now. And I'm going to ask you if you could participate, please, in answering this question. What do you think the top tactic HR professionals use to improve employee retention? Demonstrating a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, focusing on employee engagement, increasing work flexibility through flexible hours and remote work, increasing compensation, providing pay transparency, or having stay conversations, which is a great one. We'll talk about that as well. So we will launch this poll now, and we'll just take a few minutes before we share the results. What Paychex found in their study is that 27% of companies said having stay conversations improves and boosts employee retention, which I think is great. And again, not something that's going to be very costly at all. It just requires a different change in mindset, really. So we'll take a few more seconds here, and then I think we'll be ready to share these results. Great, if we could share the results now. Excellent. So it looks like the number one response for most of you is focusing on employee engagement, which is great. And I think absolutely makes sense if we want to think about improving retention. The next top strategy was increasing work flexibility through flexible hours and remote work. I think that supports all the research that we've looked at so far today. And the next strategy here was increasing compensation, which is so important too. And we've seen a lot of companies do that, and they've been effective at doing that. And, this idea of thinking about compensation and thinking about paying people for, what they're worth, and again, ties into providing pay transparency, will continue to be a very important topic over the next few years. So let's talk about another very important trend and key learning from this study, and that's around burnout. Burnout's not a new topic. We've been talking about it for years. There's lots of research out there on burnout and the impact it has on productivity. But we really saw this come to light in the past 2 years as employees were asked to do more, HR teams were asked to do more, and the burnout was very real. And balancing what we all have to balance today in our personal lives with our professional lives, it's all intertwined, especially in a remote or hybrid model. We can't separate the two. So burnout is a very real discussion. This study found that 60% of HR leaders are concerned about employee burnout, and up to 18%, that's up from it's up 18% from before COVID. So burnout, again, not new, but something that continues and will continue to be a huge conversation. And this really ties into all these themes that we're hearing all over the news, that we have been hearing all over the news for the past year around quiet quitting and the Great Resignation, the labor shortage, people not wanting to return to work at all. This is all impacted by burnout. So some strategies that we found in the research here are, number one, providing flexible work schedules. I mean, this definitely can help. And if you think about whether it's that share model of the split week model or the role share model, or just being able to offer more flexibility, that can help to alleviate some of that burnout. And again, the burnout's not just the professional burnout, it's the personal burnout too. Everyone's trying to juggle things in their own personal lives at the same time. So being able to give people back some flexibility and even some time makes a huge difference. Number two is emphasizing work-life balance as part of the company culture. Again, not a new strategy, not a new tactic, but if we really can think about making this part of the company culture and prioritizing this work-life balance, flexibility is the best way to do that. And the third approach is creating clear job descriptions and expectations to make work feel manageable. Not only does it help work feel more manageable, but it sets those expectations early with candidates and even internal employees to say, this is actually what the job is, no surprises, we're going to be honest and transparent about it, and this is what we expect of you. And, if you want to move forward, you know what to expect. And that's a very different approach. There's no secret there. There's no hidden message. It's just being honest, and it's just being very clear in what those expectations are. It's interesting too, because burnout is such an important topic. And I think when I'm looking at these strategies and when I'm looking at even some of the case studies that we've done over the past few years, it doesn't necessarily require a huge investment. We're not, asking companies to spend millions of dollars to reduce burnout. It's really looking at changing the culture and providing better communication and more flexible options. And many of those strategies are free for organizations, and they don't require huge implementation time. You can start to see those results very quickly. And you can see here just some examples of what the study found that helps with the burnout. Example is offering weekly meditation and yoga classes at no cost for employees. So not just reminders to take yoga, but actually offering and paying for those classes for employees. Providing access to an employee assistance program, including online and on-demand counseling services. Absolutely, a lot of companies have done this, and it's been very, very effective. Delivering digital training sessions to help build teamwork, communication, essentially a support system for employees. And again, that can be so effective as well. And then the final piece that I would add here is really thinking about using your employee resource groups if you have them. If you have ERGs and you're looking at maybe even reigniting your ERGs, how can you empower them to be a support system for employees too as they're dealing with burnout? Whether that's finding a peer and talking to a peer about what challenges that you might have as an employee, or really feeling like you have a support system through your ERGs. But we're seeing a lot of companies looking at reigniting those ERG programs and being very effective with it at looking at burnout and looking at well-being. The next trend in learning that we're going to talk about here is prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Such an important topic for organizations. It certainly became a priority over the past few years, but for a lot of companies, it was a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So it can't just be making a statement. It can't just be putting a statement on your career site. It really has to be a commitment, and it really has to be a cultural change. The study found that 4 in 10 of HR leaders are incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy into all aspects of employee hiring and management. The same number are committed to pay equity and compensation transparency. They're all intertwined. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just one piece of what HR has to do. It integrates with everything that we've talked about so far today. And I think for, again, a lot of companies, it just became one activity to do, or maybe one strategy to look at, but it needs to be incorporated in everything. It's a cultural change. Some approaches from this research study for companies to think about is, number one, offering bias and other diversity, equity, and inclusion related training. We found in our own research that training was the number one strategy companies were doing, but we have to almost take it one step further. We have to be able to think about how do we take the training and turn it into action. The second piece was ensuring that vendors and partners have a proven commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I love this one because it's so true. And so many HR leaders became so savvy in how they started to evaluate vendors over the past few years, asking about the leadership team, asking about the board, asking about the percentage of the workforce that's diverse at the vendor, starting to look at the demos. If you're kind of going through a technology evaluation, start to go through the vendor evaluation process and say, okay, what roles are we seeing here? Who are they giving as examples for this vendor in these demo scenarios? If it's all Michael Scott or Ted Lasso, why aren't they showing any diversity? You really want to see a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion from the vendor. And if their leadership team and their employee population is not diverse yet, are they able to kind of address that with you? And are they able to say, we have a commitment to this, we are looking at making changes, and we do recognize that that's a gap in where we're at today? And I think that statement and that honesty can go a long way. Making diversity, equity, and inclusion guidelines and documents easily accessible to employees. That's so important. We don't want employees to have to go searching all over the place to find this. It needs to be front and center and easy to access. Getting help from an HR or diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant to create a plan. A lot of companies have done this. They've used big firms, they've used small firms, but it's a great way to really think about providing expertise if you don't have it within your organization. And the one caution that I'd give there is you really want to make sure you're carefully evaluating who that consultant is. A lot of people are claiming to be experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion that are absolutely not. So you really want to think about being careful about, evaluating different consultants and who you might be using. So the next key finding here is benefits. So we're going to talk a little bit about expanding and optimizing benefits, increasing from what you might have had before the pandemic to what's currently offered. And you can see here, huge increase across all different areas. 34% said an increase in remote and hybrid work. 22% said an increase in dental insurance. That's huge because there was even a trend before COVID that a lot of companies were eliminating dental insurance as a benefit altogether. So to see that increase is huge. 19% said increase in flexible scheduling. 16% said increase in vision insurance, and 12% said an increase in their health savings account. So overall, companies recognize that employees want not only compensation, but they want benefits and competitive benefits as well. And you can see here also increase in health insurance for 11% of companies, 11% said short-term disability insurance, and 10% said an increase in retirement plans, 4% increase in life insurance, and only 2% an increase in maternity paternity leave, which we hope will be increased more. Just one interesting note from some research that we did at Aptitude, we asked companies about their approach to caregivers, especially during the pandemic. How are they approaching this? And then we surveyed employees and said, as caregivers, are you being asked about how your company can support you during this challenging time? And only 11% of employees said that they were even asked at all about, being caregivers in their personal lives. So again, that's another way to kind of think about retention and think about improving that employee engagement is, can we have these more open dialogues around not just the professional, but the personal as well? So those are some of the learnings that came out in the research, and we're going to talk a little bit about the role of technology. technology plays such a huge role in how companies are thinking about going through this change and going through this transformation. And again, that's gonna continue whether we hit this economic downturn or not. What we found is that 38% of HR leaders said their HR software technology increased employee productivity. I think that makes complete sense, especially when you're thinking about remote work. Some additional benefits were improved ability to manage HR processes, better engagement, greater ability to train and build skills, stronger ability to attract and hire candidates, and an improvement in retention. Improving and boosting efficiency and streamlining processes. The interesting thing is that like over the past 2 years, efficiency became everything. This is the number one metric across recruitment, across retention, employee experience. Efficiency is really the currency for how we view success in HR and talent. And for companies that are looking at, technology, this is a huge benefit. We're streamlining processes, we're automating processes, we're improving that efficiency. 1/3 of HR leaders say that changing of their current payroll solution or technology has saved their company between 60 and 120 hours a year in both preparing payroll and fixing payroll issues. This is, again, a benefit not just to the company, but to HR professionals that are feeling overwhelmed and overworked on a day-to-day. And if you go back to even the very first thing that we shared about the number one task, which is chasing down employees for their hours and their time, all of that and being able to automate payroll and, workforce management really creates huge improvements in quality of life for HR professionals. So how can HR tools really help companies? There's a couple different strategies that I want to talk about here, and it really doesn't require you to be an expert. It just requires you to have a passion for this and want to kind of take this on. Start to take stock in what you already know. I was with a company not too long ago, and they described this as journaling, which I thought was great. I loved it. It's not like your Dear Diary journaling, but it's really just taking note of what's happening in your company, understanding your own experience, talking to different stakeholders, and start to just take note of it all. What's worked, what doesn't work, what are you using, what aren't you using, what do people actually want? And just start to journal that, take note of that. Assess the HR related pain points at your company, and then understand what outsourced HR services might be available to support you. And with that, I think that's our last slide. So we are going to turn it back over to some Q&A, and I'm going to take a look here to see if we have any questions. So we have one question that came in around where should companies start? And it's a great question because I think there's so much that we shared today, everything from recruiting to, employee burnout to thinking about benefits. And, when you think about transformation, usually the biggest obstacle and what doesn't often happen is that, once you feel overwhelmed, transformation just stops altogether. So where can you start? And the advice that I give here is to start small and take an iterative approach. We don't have to do everything at the same time. Look at really what the biggest pain point is for your organization, and you can definitely start there. That might be recruiting, maybe you have challenges with onboarding, maybe employee burnout. Is there stress there too? Starting with an employee engagement survey might be a great way to really figure out where that starting point should be. And, a lot of this, especially around the discussion around hybrid and remote work, is going to be experimenting. It's going to be seeing what works, adjusting and changing, asking employees for feedback, and continuing to reevaluate. So it's an exciting time to be in HR. I know it's incredibly overwhelming, but there's huge opportunities, and making mistakes is definitely going to be part of the journey. So don't be afraid to make them. So I think that's it for the questions that we had in. I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you to Paychex for doing this great research, and to HR Executive for hosting this wonderful webinar. So thank you.